Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this first debate in our new democracy promotion debate series at Hertie School of Governance, organized by our research center, ERCAS. Please cut off your microphones and camera and keep them cut off on the length of this debate. Thank you very much for this. Please use the chat function to address your questions. You can also use the chat functions to post links to materials of interest that we think the other participants should see. Please do not use the chat functions to write your opinions about other people, which may border defamations, because we're going to delete them. And you're going to endanger this new space that we're trying to create, where to discuss very challenging topics like corruption or attempts to democracy in a way which remains civil and democratic. Thank you very much. It is a great privilege for us at Hertie School to introduce tonight two quite formidable women. The first is the woman from whose article this conversation is going to start. The article is actually only the latest in her series of early warnings, which have started some years ago. I'm speaking, of course, about Sarah Chayes, a journalist and an international expert on corruption and security, who went in Afghanistan for National Public Radio, but then actually became an advisor to top military leaders, and who used a lot of her influence to change in real times what she was seeing there. And her latest article in Foreign Affairs actually offers the title of the present debate. Our other participant is a woman not in the least more or less extraordinary. She is Muska Dastageer, if I pronounced her name correctly, who returns from Afghanistan, where she was a lecturer for the American University in Kabul. But if I understand correctly, she managed to get out of there in due time. She worked for many years in Afghanistan. She's going to tell us a little bit about this, on governance, evaluating various programs. She is an expert on corruption. She has a degree from Oxford University and another one from Institut d'études politiques in Paris. So she's in the same time a top educated scholar, as well as a person who invested some years of her life into transforming Afghanistan. So thank you very much for joining us for this first debate, which will be followed during this academic years by a number of others in the same vein, which ask, how is democracy promotion going to function after this Afghanistan debacle? How are we going to reorganize this, if we are going to reorganize this? And we're going to try each time to have someone who is like a top analyst from the Western Hemisphere, and another person who is really somebody who has come or is already in one of the endangered places, in one of the places where, you know, people try to get to the plains in this moment, because it's not clear what their future is going to be. So Sarah, of course, I would like to start with you. So first, I'd like to start with our private conversation and to ask, you write this very challenging article where you basically say that the American intervention and the international intervention had an important contribution to the inherent corruption of this regime, which led to this demise. Were you trolled? Did you receive a lot of negative reactions? Did people say you are unpatriotic? And or what was the reaction after your Foreign Affairs article?
Interestingly, it's been a very positive reaction, actually. It's been basically versions of, boy, this is the first clear and understandable thing that I've read that helps me, you know, figure out, get a sense of what just happened and why it happened. Almost no trolls.
So other people, do you think, were thinking along the same lines, but didn't dare to speak out so clearly as you did?
I think that's possible. On the other hand, there is a tendency in the United States to make sweeping generalizations about Afghanistan, which I had predicted also, which is to say something on the order of, you know, those Afghans, they really don't want to be governed. They're just not ready for democracy. We tried as hard as we could, but, you know, it's silly to try to change another country, especially in, at the point of a gun, supposedly. So, and I've heard this from the beginning. I mean, I've heard this from the early 2000s, some version of that. And my answer is, number one, we did change Afghanistan. It's not as though the Afghanistan we're looking at today is unchanged, but we like to think that we only changed it for the better. We like to think about women like Muska, being able to take positions in the public eye that they wouldn't have been able to take before. But I would look at the features of the country, of the democracy that we actually brought. And maybe we can discuss that a little bit further, but I would just like to say for now that it's not a very flattering picture. It's a picture of cronies and billionaires in positions of power, capturing the revenue streams, bending the rules to serve their purposes, using, phony bank accounts to give themselves loans that they have no intent of repaying, things like that, which start to resemble much of what the United States has come to resemble over the last 20 years. And that is something, again, I got a number of readers, who agreed with that, who said that there is a parallel here, and it is time to really focus not just on democracy promotion abroad, but democracy promotion at home.
Well, thank you very much for that. And not just on corruption in the countries that we want to change, but the corruption of the instruments that we send there to change the country. So Muska, did you agree with this article? Did this article reason with you? And are things that you disagreed with? What is your perspective?
Thank you, Alina. I really enjoyed reading the article. I think it was quite spot on. It furthered this idea of a mirror existing, right? That the corruption we saw in Afghanistan mirrored some, a similar dysfunction in the West, in the US. I would probably, one of the reasons this argument appeals so much to me is not just that it's an actual, because I think it's true, but also I would expand the argument a little bit. And I would say that, has Afghanistan, as a failure of the liberal peace building paradigm, and I'm looking at this as also a lecturer of peace and conflict studies, has Afghanistan as a failure of the liberal peace paradigm, is Afghanistan pointing to a greater failure within the West, more specifically within the thinking we see, within the liberal democracy doctrine. So I think that the line of thinking is really interesting, and I think it can even be expanded upon. I also, I think that one thing that I would add, and perhaps Sarah did mention it, I don't really recall it right now, but one thing I would add is that the US corruption in Afghanistan wasn't just a mirror of corruption in Afghanistan, but the West, the international community and the US also contributed directly and indirectly to corruption in Afghanistan. I think that external impulses from the international community, which spurred or incentivized corruption in Afghanistan, and local drivers of corruption, I think these fed off of each other. They provided one another with permissive conditions and a permissive environment to thrive. I can get into that a little bit later, but I think it was on both sides, and it breathed air into each other, if that makes sense.
Right, of course. But, question is, could this have been avoided? I mean, we know that corruption is this result between opportunities which are created and constraints that the society can put. But are not all these big international interventions a fabulous opportunity for corruption? I mean, you go in a place, you pour a lot of money, very few people there. And I've seen that some people have compared Afghanistan with Vietnam. And they said, I mean, actually, each time you create some sort of client state, which only exists in order to spend the money, which doesn't gain enough legitimacy in a society because they do not spread what they receive from you enough, thinly around, and no attempt at equality or anything else. And therefore, the intervention itself, unless it is a completely different type of intervention, is doomed to create only corruption, clientelism, and in the end, an army which only is looking around for bribes and doesn't receive salaries, which I understand that was the situation. Sarah, tell us a little bit more clear. What do you think was problematic from the start, creating opportunities which are simply proved too high to be curtailed? And what do you think could have been actually avoided and mistakes were made, by humans?
So I agree 100% with what Muska said before your question, Alina, which is to say that the way the US interacted with individuals in Afghanistan not only allowed the corruption to flourish, but in fact reinforced and enabled it. There's no question about that. And that's why I say we kind of made Afghan governance in our own image, but in a very almost exaggerated version of our image. And so your question, Alina, raises an interesting, I want to say, dialectic between systems and individuals. What we had arrived at by, I would say, about 2006-07 was a systematized kleptocracy, meaning this wasn't just corruption on the part of individual Afghan venal officials filling their own pockets, but rather it was the sort of operating system of what had crystallized into a corrupt network or a set of networks. And what's confusing about that is that they can appear to be rivals, and they are sort of like mafia families, that are both rivals and allies at the same time.
Cartels,
and they're
cartels.
Yeah, they're cartels that seem to be opposed to each other. And yet at the same time, they're also allied, and they are also in solidarity in maintaining the overall system. So that's the situation we had reached by about 2007. But it starts out by preferential treatment of individuals. So the very first thing that the United States did wrong was usher back into Afghanistan upon the fall of the Taliban, notorious war criminals whose very, I want to say, violent extortions during the late 1980s and early 1990s had led a kind of beleaguered population, or an indignant and desperate population, at least in the Afghan South, to actually accept the Taliban as possibly a better alternative to the violent extortion that was being perpetrated at just about every street corner. So it's almost as though, the Taliban were a kind of, in the 1990s, were a kind of violent, horrible chemotherapy operation, a very painful operation to take cancer out of the Afghan body politic. And so when the Americans come and say, okay, it's time for this chemotherapy to end because it's now damaging that very same body politic, that's fine. But why did they take a syringe full of the cancer cells, meaning these violent and corrupt warlords, and inject them right back into Afghanistan? So that's number one. Number two,
was there an alternative to these people?
Of course there was. You find other people who the communities considered to be their thoughtful leaders. And of course, you're right. The Taliban did whatever they could to extirpate, thoughtful, well-grounded, intelligent, public-spirited community leaders. But with a little bit of effort, You could have found some of them and certainly not simply transferred the people you used as your proxy army on the ground, which is to say the warlords, into governors, which is what we did. I mean, there was no reason that people who had fighting credentials were then bestowed governing credentials. So that's an initial problem. And then more directly to your question, it all depends how you convey the money. Why were there no conditions? Why were there no oversight provisions? Why were there no provisions to create local oversight bodies, train civilians up in, watching over the implementation of projects that were provided? Why was there no, I want to say, intelligence gathering on who was being allowed in to, for example, contract bidding conferences? So I could see outside Kandahar that it was the governor's brother who controlled the militia that was used for outer rim security for the base, for the international military base, and all the contracting conferences, the bidding conferences, were held inside that base. That means that the governor's brother got to decide who was even allowed to go in for a bid. And the international presence was completely blind to those types of rigging of the system by local actors, and therefore, and just assumed that, for example, the governor represented the people, instead of wondering whether the governor didn't perhaps represent himself and his network. And therefore, by standing side by side with the governor and enhancing his stature and allowing development projects to be distributed through his network, what we ended up doing was immeasurably reinforcing and enabling his own corruption.
Don't you think that this was something that, that the international community and the Americans, you're speaking mostly of the Americans, really believed that this is the way how things can be organized, that unless you allow these people to build a client basis, there's never going to be leaders strong enough, and then you're not going to have partners in that society. So don't you think that it was rather an estimation of this kind, that you cannot, build in Afghanistan out of the sudden the kind of, impersonalistic bureaucracies and that you see in the West? And you have to have partners, and you have to allow your partners to consolidate themselves. Okay, so, and corruption is the price to that.
The price to whom? I mean, I agree. I think you're exactly right that was the preconception of many Western actors. And believe me, not only the Americans. I actually had more difficulty conveying some of these realities to Europeans on the ground in Afghanistan than I did to Americans. In a way, the Americans were cynical and the Europeans were naive, if I can make a generalization. But I think largely you're right. But I want to say, in that last question of yours or point of yours, and corruption is the cost, I do think that's the way a lot of Westerners see it. And my question is, cost to whom? And I'm afraid that we often think about the cost to ourselves and in quote unquote wasted money and this and that. What we don't see is the cost to Afghan citizens who are, after all, the importance isn't that we have a relationship with our counterparts. The really important thing in an insurgency situation is that the population has a relationship of trust and of sovereignty, frankly, with its governing authority. And I think, this is a democracy series. And if there is one underlying ideological principle of democracy, it's that the people are the sovereign, right? So if our intervention is structured in such a way that the interveners become the sovereign, and the government becomes the client, well, yes, it's going to be a relationship and a government that is toxic to democracy. But if in fact our intent was to allow democracy to flourish. Again, it's not a question of bureaucracy so much as it is one of empowering the people to exercise their sovereign power over the government. And that we failed utterly to do.
Muska, please, what do you think?
Well,
Is there a misconception? I mean, where there's just distrust that this is not, you know, a society based on individuals, and therefore there was a little bit more on, you know, on groups, on clans, on tribes, and therefore there was some cynical calculation that you have to allow this society to organize itself as it sees fit, and just, you know, sort of fund it in order to create a counterstructure to Taliban. Obviously, it didn't work, but it seems easier to me to think it was a miscalculation than to consider that everybody was so blind for so many years, when there were warning reports, there were organizations who wrote, I mean, you wrote, for instance, Sarah, but other organizations also did. So there's been a lot of warning, and since nothing changed, I mean, they simply continued to allow this systematic corruption as governance regime to flourish there on Western money.
Well, I think it started out as a well-intentioned thing. I think it started out as the best possible recourse in 2001. You had the Bonn conference and you spoke to the interlocutors with whom you could speak with. You had to rely on them. But I think, you know, at one point, and just a few years after that, I think it became difficult to deny realities in Kabul. What effectively happened was the US and the international community, like Sarah rightly said, contributing to corruption by empowering from the beginning corrupt officials, combative officials who in many ways still were in a civil war, were still operating within the logic of civil war. And with time, their power and networks grew, and they became entrenched within the ministries, the institutions that they had been allotted, that they had been given. They were able to decide who could get hired, but also who could not get hired. I've heard several accounts, and this brings us a little bit to some of the human costs, or some of the costs of this corruption. I've heard several accounts from of brilliant people who were of brilliant Afghans, well-educated Afghans who were hungry, you know, who were hungry to create change and serve their country, being kept out or being ejected from ministries because there was a fear that they would rock the boat just by virtue of their integrity, by virtue of their reform-mindedness, by virtue of their intelligence. And I think the international community couldn't do much about this and, you know, political corruption, administrative corruption, because at some level, I think they too feared the destabilizing effects of poking entrenched elites, those they had empowered from the beginning. So, you know, we talk about bribery, we talk about how, you know, the operational level frontline staff taking bribes from common Afghans. And this was serious. It was serious because it corroded the trust, the confidence of common Afghans in the system. But what more, I think, directly led to the collapse of the Afghan state is the kind of corruption that took place within these elite networks, these circles that sort of divvied up government institutions between one another. They would jealously guard the ministries under their control, like little fiefdoms, ensuring that funding flows going to these ministries would go to members of their networks. So there was a really fierce competition over contracts, positions, funding, and this is where I think the inner rot of the state, the institutionalized corruption, that which had, you know, that which began creating these really powerful path dependencies from 2002. That's where it resided, and there were no real countervailing impulses. There was no good reason for corrupt officials to be afraid, because they were ensconced within these protective, powerful networks that could create a huge fuss if members of their networks were prosecuted. I think Sarah mentions one example in her article where a phone call was enough to have one corrupt official released. I often mention this logic of the Civil War carrying over into the 2001 to 2021 Republic. And what I mean by this is that even though the violence, the intercommunal violence that we saw in the 90s, even though that ceased in the 90s before the emergence of the Taliban Emirate, the first Taliban Emirate, and even though it wasn't there in the years of the Republic either, because the focus was on fighting the Taliban, the way government was actually conducted was like a loosely held mass of coalitions, a loosely held mass of rivaling networks, and what was one of the defining characteristics was this fierce competition for funds and contracts and positions. In some way,
if I may, Muska, what happened with all these people now? Did they lose everything, or in fact, were they able to negotiate to salvage some of their rents? Or are they, entirely out? And what happened with these people? Did they manage to escape with what they gained? Did they manage to negotiate the rents with the new leaders, or at least to keep a part of them? Or are they actually facing mortal perils? So what happened with them? I see that people make comments, interesting comments on the forum, that in fact it's not so much different from Kosovo or other places in international occupation, which are all extremely corrupt, which all resulted in client regimes. All these other places were missing were the Taliban to come in and make all this corrupt establishment collapse, as it happened here. Because nowhere did we live so spectacularly, and nowhere did we leave such a force on the borders as we did here. So what happened with these people? Let's talk a little bit about the winners of all this corrupt arrangement, because one interesting thing coming out of Sarah's article is that there are various categories of winners, not just these client governments and their networks in the Afghanistan, but also some people on the Western side, right?
A lot of people.
A lot. Well, let's talk a little bit what happened. Who are these people on the Western side? But first, Muska, tell us, because you have probably are the person who has been the most recently there and have most ties. What happened with all these people who made all this lots of money? All these profiteers, administrators, politicians, policemen, whatever they are, all right, who profited from public contracts. Are they going to be hanged in public places now by the Taliban, or what happened with them?
I think that the small scale corruption, the frontline bureaucrats or frontline staff who would take bribes. I mean, I think that's something that no one can track or trace at this point. And it also it wouldn't make so much sense when you have, large scale, much more egregious theft that took place. And when it comes to that, when it comes to the families and the networks, the ethnic political networks that looted a lot of funds, I don't think that they are I don't think they're in Afghanistan. I don't think that they are. I'm sure they have maintained homes outside of Afghanistan. We hear about villas being bought in Dubai and Virginia, and I don't think they're anywhere near Afghanistan. I think they're safe, and that's it's fine that they're safe, but there's also a really tragic component to how those who were engaged in this incessant self-enrichment, they're not going to be suffering any consequences. I don't think so.
Yeah, but they left, the innocent left behind are going to suffer consequences. Sarah, let's move to the American profiteers a little bit.
Well, and I'd love to go back as always. I mean, this is so fascinating. And I'd love to just touch and maybe offer a slightly different perspective on something Muska said earlier, which is about the quote unquote low-level corruption. It's true that the shakedowns that happen on street level aren't quote unquote hollowing out government institutions in the same way that some of the high level capture of contracts and things like that did. However, from the perspective of the ordinary population, what they experience on a daily level is brutal, contemptuous shakedowns by every single government official that they encounter. And that doesn't just reduce their trust in government, it actually makes them loathe their government. And so then the question is, how do you expect population that is being mistreated by government officials that they encounter on a daily basis, almost as much as they're being mistreated by Taliban, how would you have expected them to then take a risk on behalf of that same government? And I have to say that, at least in Kandahar, where I have, some detailed on the ground information, it is a number of those low-level officials who are being dragged out of their houses and shot at night. In particular, there was a police chief of Kandahar who was assassinated a while ago, but he was known, his men were known basically for turning arrest into torture for ransom. So throughout Kandahar over the last about 2, 3, 4 years ago is when I started really hearing about it, they were just arresting anyone and torturing them until their families could cough up a ransom. Well, those men are being killed. So there is, you could call it score settling, or you could call it, summary justice for some of the more brutal types of street level corruption. And then what I would like to say as to, who made out, here's how I understand the corruption in Afghanistan to also mirror corruption, not just in US delivery of, foreign and security policy to other countries, but US corruption at home. It's like this. The corruption is the operating principle. Muska has talked about kind of tribal political networks, but another way of thinking about it is that it's, and I don't disagree with that, but you can add this dimension to what she said, which is it's networks that interweave sectors that in the West we often think of as separate, meaning public officials, captains of industry, in other words, business leaders, look a lot like the failed states we like to talk about in the developing world. What of these policies succeeded? COVID, financial meltdown in 2008, and the European sovereign debt crisis, 2 lost wars, environmental devastation beyond reckoning. What I want to say is that what I'm saying is
we do not learn lessons, right? It doesn't seem that lessons are learned.
We're not only not learning lessons, we are governed ourselves by corrupt networks that threaten the future of our species. I don't want to sound like Cassandra, but I feel a little bit like Cassandra. I think this network corruption is not just an issue confronting, Western foreign and security policy and developing countries. I actually think it's the most important issue facing our generation.
Well, I am a professor of corruption. I'm a professor of democracy studies, but I teach mostly corruption. So I'm not going to disagree with you. But I must also say to people who feel the need that Sarah goes too far in criticizing United States here, that we're going to have other guests. So we're going to balance this until the end. Next time we'll meet with Larry Diamond, who I think is going to be a little bit, more defensive on the American side. But I would really not like to be defensive tonight. So I'm going to ask, okay, so this is really, besides the planned retreat, was really a debacle in many, many ways. Is anybody going to answer for this? What we discuss now and what other people wrote, because I know Drago Kosh, I know other people who worked on anti-corruption in Afghanistan. People knew a lot and they wrote a lot about this. Is anything going to happen? Is like a mega audit of some sort going to happen retrospectively in order for all of us, an investigation of everybody. I mean, I don't know, can be Congress, can be aside NGOs, which I'm convinced that they already know and they will do something. Is anything going to come out of it? Are we going to learn some lessons from some investigation made on how our money was actually used in order to prop up a client regime which fell the next moment and exposed a lot of innocent people?
Is that to me?
Yeah, I mean, is there any discussion of an investigation? I'm not asking.
I mean, there already has been one by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, and it was, there's a book that just came out called the, what is it, the Afghanistan Papers by Craig Whitlock, based on, I think, documents that were provided to him by SIGAR. SIGAR always wanted, you know, a thorough and clear-eyed review of activity, but will the American kind of society and political institutions take this on as the warning that they should? I don't think so. And in terms of individuals, I mean, if there were an individual I would like to see investigated, it would be Zalmay Khalilzad, who was ambassador to Afghanistan, who negotiated this so-called peace deal, which in effect conferred sovereignty onto the Taliban upon signature. So the Taliban basically had de facto sovereignty back in February of 2020. And the idea that anyone imagined that in that situation, the Afghan government would be able to hold, especially given the rot that Muska has talked about and the generalized corruption and the disgust of ordinary people, is just dreaming. And so, you know, again, I would like to know what was going on actually during those negotiations, on whose behalf was he actually negotiating, since it looks like a deal that the Taliban could have written. Muska, do you see in Europe, in Denmark, I mean, anywhere in Europe, any appetite for reckoning?
Sorry about that. No, I don't. That's the shortest answer. I really don't. I wish it would happen, and I'm sure that a few billions of dollars might be found in bank accounts around the world, but a lot of the money went back to the U.S. You know, development companies won huge contracts. They relied extensively on contractors, development contractors, defense contractors, because effectively speaking, there wasn't any human capital in Afghanistan when the international intervention began. So yeah, a lot of it was just redirected back to the US. And that which was stolen by local corrupt officials, I very much hope it could be located, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it will. I mean, I think everyone who's worked in anti-corruption in Afghanistan have experienced building cases, doing evaluations, flagging ongoing corruption or risks, vulnerabilities to corruption in various institutions, and being met with something like apathy or lip service. And so it's kind of difficult for me to
Yes, allow me to step in here. I mean, you made a lot of evaluations, all right? A lot of evaluations in your work, right? In your development work. So at any moment, was a project suspended due to risk of corruption? Were any warnings taken? Was any follow-up related to all this? Or simply the warning taken that maybe the institution that we built is just not sustainable the way we built it, since it's parallel to informal institutions there?
I'm going to answer the question in a slightly different way. It's, you know, the entire our approach to development and several characteristics of the development industry as a whole creates a climate where corruption thrives. The pursuit of profit in the development sector exists very uneasily with the obligation to produce something ethical, effective, and durable. So for instance, NGOs with lengthy prior experience from other developing countries, when in Afghanistan, they would often fall back on emulating what had worked for them in other contexts, because this is something they did well. They had prior success with it. They had a lot of the paper, they had a lot of the material, the reports that they could just go in and tweak minimally. And so the problem within the development industry, as I've seen it play out in Afghanistan, wasn't just that money was assigned to problems, determined by technocrats or officials who weren't present in Afghanistan, diagnosing problems from afar, but imposing not just out of place solutions, but also sometimes inventing almost out of place problems, but also that implementers often didn't do a very good job. They didn't make interventions sufficiently contextual and needs-based, and that's a prerequisite if interventions, programs, projects are to be effective, responsive, and durable. So I have a couple of examples. In Bamyan province, for instance, in one village in 2010, one INGO had trained some 800 women in one village in tailoring. So, and this was a village of about 800 families. So basically, every home had a tailor, but when you have one tailor in every home, how are you going to find customers? Another example is in Mazar-e-Sharif this year. Another international organization had trained some 2,000 women in tailoring. I think 8,000 women in tailoring and more than 2,000 in beauty parlor work. This is within one city. And again, the problem is, well, how are they going to find customers? The problem is also, I also encountered the problem with training programs, TVET programs. So in one example, and this is a really egregious example, I think, there was a self-help tenet of a women's economic empowerment program. And they were, as part of this, women were given training on health issues. And one of the main topics was HIV/AIDS prevention. And, in 2000, I don't know the numbers for 2020 or 2021, but in 2017, the number of people with AIDS in Afghanistan was less than 6,000. So this component of the program was obviously, from a manual that was designed for a different context, a different developing nation, but was being reused in Afghanistan.
Okay, but the corruption here is basically only the fact that this inadequacy, it's explained by the need of these organizations to get some money out of this big pot of Afghanistan, right? That is, there's no other corruption. But yes, when you put it together and you result in so much inadequacy, this indeed becomes dangerous. I see what you mean. Well, but under these circumstances, what you described, so far, we covered American corruption, we covered Afghan corruption, and now we are discussing the corruption of the development industry, right? But those are there, okay? At least wherever we would go, this is the situation. So should we have interventions like this in other countries? Should this kind of complex democracy building, state building continue when ourselves, those who promote this, the tools that we have look like you described them, right? Let's recall when I was young, there was this nice film, science fiction film on television, Star Trek Next Generation was called, okay, where these people were going around around planets, and the number one dictum was that you are not allowed to intervene in the life of other civilizations, because maybe you do not understand the situation well and you will produce more damage than good. Is this the lesson that we should take out of this, or is it simply too late to take this lesson because we encouraged people to expect us to go to help somewhere, even if we apparently don't do it very well?
My view is that we will willy-nilly end up doing this again. It's almost, I mean, look at the conditions in various developing countries and look at the kind of political stakes in Western countries. I think it's inevitable we do this at some point. And therefore, the premise needs to be challenged. The premise that you based your question on, which is that this is how we are, that's what has to change, right? We have to do it better. We have to make our own democracies less corrupt and more dedicated to the public interest. And if we don't, we're doomed. It's that simple. So I feel like this whole issue is not at all a theoretical academic conversation. It is a really urgent issue, and it involves starting at home. It involves reducing, I'm going to get really cultural now, reducing the public applause given to amassing money. Back in the 60s, it was actually looked on a little bit, with a frown if somebody was extremely rich. That was not seen automatically as a mark of their honesty or success. Now it's as though if you're rich, you must be good. Well, we have to change that. We have to change the cultural permissiveness around the super rich. Because if you take, again, going back to what Muska and I have been talking about corrupt networks, these are networks that are fundamentally captained by the super rich, in and out of government, in and out of the straight criminal world. But it's the super rich, it's the billionaires. And frankly, they are far, far more dangerous to ordinary people than terrorists are. We've got our priorities wrong in terms of understanding who is the threat to our future. We have to, I think, swivel ourselves around, come up with institutions and mechanisms that incentivize governing in the public interest and disincentivize governing in, personal interest.
Partial interest, yes.
Yeah, both at home and abroad.
Yeah. Muska, I will give you the final word as tell us what we should do. What would you like to see happening in the near future so that all this negative experience is not entirely lost? We learn something and then we do it better the next time.
I would like one of the key lessons of the Afghan experience to be that nation building cannot be done from the top down. It needs to be done from the bottom up. A critical shortcoming of the past 20 years was the absence of sufficient local ownership in the nation building project, the ability of Afghans to shape the pace with which to reach a specific outcome and to decide what that specific outcome looked like. You can't really term it a mistake, nor can you situate responsibility or culpability for this anywhere, least of all with international agencies. Either that mobilization, the necessary mobilization for a bottom-up impulse, either that mobilization and the underlying tension, the political awareness, either it is at a point where it makes sense and where it can lead to activism and greater ownership, or it isn't. I think that, and this might be an unpopular, controversial thing to say, but I sometimes think that the large-scale presence of the international community in Afghanistan kind of paralyzed that struggle or postponed it. Looking at it now, looking at the convulsions of activism erupting after the fall of Kabul and other big cities, I think that there was an expectation, over these past 20 years, that the international community and the magnitude of international funding coming into Afghanistan could make that fight redundant or could sort of save Afghans from having to go into that. But what we see now is that it couldn't, the international community's presence and all this funding being poured into Afghanistan couldn't take the place of that important clash that needs to be worked out. I think the answer to how Afghanistan arrives at stability and peace lies in the direct conversations between people who think differently inside Afghanistan. The woman demonstrator in Kabul reasoning, rationalizing her position to the Talib fighter who was trying to stop her. And what the intervention did was keep those two crucial interlocutors apart. One would be, concentrated in the cities, the other would be in the rural countryside. And each side, because of that distance and because of the war playing out, violence playing out, was able to some extent to dehumanize the other. And now in the direct face-to-face encounters, the absurdities of that dehumanization should begin to dawn on people, and it's from that it's from that micro level change that seeds that seeds of transformational change can begin to trickle upwards to community levels, meso levels, and and the level of the state. So something that should have been done years and years ago, we're seeing that beginning to play out now. And it's one of the key reasons why I'm hopeful. When I see women protesting in the streets of Kabul or Mazar-e-Sharif, something that was unimaginable to me, even during the years of the Republic, but it's being done now, and those who are and they're standing face to face with Talib fighters, and then some of them react violently, others look overwhelmed and confused, and you see, okay, these are village boys. And you realize also the heterogeneity that exists within the Taliban, right? So yeah, I think it has to be the crucial lesson for the international community shouldn't be that nation building is just to be dismissed, but that it needs to be done differently.
Exactly. Can I just come in behind you, Muska, and say, I'm very touched by what you just said, and it echoes a feeling that kind of washed over me a couple of weeks, maybe even within the first week or so after the fall of Kabul, which was, my goodness, sometimes it takes calamity. Sometimes only through crisis can transformation really happen. And quite honestly, it's easy for me, I'm outside the country and I'm not having to switch houses every night like friends of mine in Kandahar are, but this government stitched together of aging war criminals and born again kleptocrats, it was not reformable. It was so reinforced by the international community, moral and material support. It was so entrenched, it was not going to get reformed. And this may be the opportunity for your generation. And I just hope that you can seize it and that you can use the same patient determination that, frankly, the Pakistani military intelligence agency largely, backing the Taliban, used to bring about a victory that was 18 years in the making. I hope it won't take you all 18 years, but as wonderful as these demonstrations are, they in and of themselves won't transform the situation. But if you can plan and move with deliberation and with foresight, you can transform your country. Well, and may we learn from you. May we in the West learn from you.
Let's hope it's a beginning. It's a beginning in this calamity, as you put it. And meanwhile, I think we should also push on our side for lessons learned, for a lot of audits in the development industry, for understanding exactly why we got it so wrong and why we contributed so little, and in fact actually damaged more than bringing good. And I want to thank everyone I want to thank our excellent speakers. I want to thank the wonderful people who wrote on chat. It was a lively, very good conversation. We're going to make use of all of this. We're still thinking how to follow up. But until then, our next conversation with Larry Diamond is going to be on October 27, but you're going to hear from us. Thank you for joining us tonight. Wonderful women we had with us tonight, a lot of food for thought. Thank you. Until next time.
Thank you. And thanks to the Hertie School and ERCAS.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation.
And we hope to see our guests and other people live also on site in Berlin in the near future. We live with this hope.